Welcome to the Battlefield Theologian Podcast. This is the beginning of a new series. The Church Militant. History in 10 minutes. In each episode, we will journey through the story of the Church, from the first century to the present day. You will meet bold believers, courageous leaders, defining councils, and powerful moments that shape the faith. These episodes are short, focused and filled with historical and theological depth. Whether you are a pastor, a student, or simply hungry to understand your spiritual heritage, this series is for you.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to our Church History Understanding. This week we're going to be looking at the patristics. We're going to look at three in particular, of the individuals, the disciples of the apostles. So let's jump into it as I share my screen. So looking at the patristics, after the last after the last apostle, John, died, what happens next? Well, what we have to understand is a few things here. Is that there are several men from the 2nd to the 4th century, which we're going to be going over several of these individuals. These men were the disciples of the apostles. And the great thing is that we have here is found in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, is that Paul writes this to Timothy. So within this verse right here, we have 4 generations of Christians. Paul writes this to Timothy, which is the recipient. It says, "In these things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men," that's generation 3, who will be able to teach others also, that generation 4. So here's just a real rough family tree timeline, just to show you kind of the connectivity, the family tree of the church fathers. But then what I want us to get into is the first guy that we're going to look at is the Clement of Rome. After the apostle John dies, the church does not stop. The church does not cease because 2 Timothy 2:2 is in full force. So Clement, funny enough, is to be the fourth, according to the Roman Catholics, the fourth pope. But what's interesting is that he's the fourth pope, and the pope then was evangelical, if not Protestant. So Clement was a pastor in the city of Rome, and he was ministering there, and he wrote an epistle to the church in Corinth. Clement pastored the church in 90 to 100 AD. Clement was both the disciple of not just Peter, but also Paul, and he was martyred under the Emperor Trajan in 100 AD. He is potentially also the same Clement we see being referenced that Paul writes about in Philippians 4:3, but we don't know that for a fact. He wrote a letter to the Corinthian church in the late 90s. So think about this. The book of Corinthians was written roughly around 54, 56 AD. Clement decides to write another letter back to them to correct them because clearly they didn't pick up what was happening. Sadly, what had happened is after Paul had written his letter, in between that period of time, when the reason why Clement is writing is because the Corinthian church had fired their leadership, completely removed their eldership, removed their leaders, and established their own leaders. And Clement is writing to correct them. And he addressed the ideas and the issues that they were having within the Corinthian church and within the congregation of the divisiveness that was happening. So sadly, they didn't get the right feedback, if you will, from when Paul wrote his letter. How did Clement die? Well, Clement was killed and was martyred by having a anchor tied to his neck, and he was tossed off of a ship into the Black Sea. Now, this is interesting because, especially as you look at this photo, this is obviously not a historically accurate photo. As you can see in the medieval ages in which this was done, and you can tell this is too from an artist's force perspective, how the individuals are extremely large at the front, smaller in the back, just trying to show and direct your attention to Clement. But again, this is not historically accurate because I don't think that Clement would have been wearing his popery hat there as he was being martyred. But sadly, he was martyred. The next item, or the next individual we're going to look at, is Ignatius of Antioch. Now, if you think about it, in Acts chapter 11, verse 26, that was the first time that Christians were called or labeled Christians. It was established, the church in Antioch was established in the 40s under Paul and Barnabas during the missionary journeys. And as we're looking at where is Ignatius of Antioch, you can see on this map here where Antioch is. It's just north of Damascus by a few days' journey, if that. he was a disciple of John, the Apostle John, and he was a friend of Polycarp, which we're also going to look at here in a minute. He was martyred in Rome around 117, and an issue that he addressed within the time period during this time is the understanding of bishop and elder. Now, the Greek word for bishop is episkopoi, and for elder, it's presbyteros. Now, Paul uses them synonymously in the same context together in 1 Timothy chapter 3. But what Ignatius does here is he makes a distinction that within the plurality of elders, there should be one individual named the bishop, or in the title of a bishop, who's a primary teaching pastor. He is the first among equals, but he has been called out to have the authority, if you will, of being what we would call the senior pastor, or what we would also call potentially the teaching pastor. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, because as we progress on in church history, you're going to see how that term bishop, which right now, if you're an evangelical like myself and a Protestant, you're going to be thinking, oh, that has a bad notion. But it started out as, and it is a very biblical word, and it had its understanding and rooted in the type of governance within the church, that the bishop was the main or senior pastor within a group in plurality of elders. So around 117, he was martyred, and he was martyred by being fed to the Circus Maximus and the animals. Now, this was before the Colosseum was built, and so they did not have a Colosseum then. They had the Circus Maximus, and he was fed to wild lions, as many other Christians were as well. Because thanks to Nero ushering in Christian persecution right around roughly in 64 to 66 AD, we have 250 plus years of Christian persecution after that point in time. Now, another item I want to bring up about Ignatius, as I'm running out of time here, is that Ignatius is quoted in one of his writings. He wrote several books. One of them is a fantastic writing. Ignatius writes against the heresies. But one item that you can see from this slide here is that the church and Christians have always celebrated on Sunday. We have always had our worship services on Sunday. One, you can see this in the book of Revelation, as it's referenced as the Lord's Day. And two, here, even within the second century, early second century, the church practiced worshiping Christ on Sundays, which is why he's saying that our calendar is regulated by the Lord's Day, first day of the week, which is Sunday. So that's Ignatius of Antioch. Finally, we move to Polycarp of Smyrna. This was one of the 7 churches that John writes about in the book of Revelation. He wrote one letter to the Philippian church, and it was in 155 AD in which he was martyred. Many of you are probably familiar with his martyrdom. One idea that I like to always convey with his martyrdom is that when the Roman soldiers came to arrest him, he offered them dinner if they would allow him to go upstairs and to pray. So the Roman soldiers did that. He fed his captors, went upstairs, prayed, and prepared his heart and soul, and then he was carried off. Now, when he stood before the governor in the province at the time, he was 86 years old, and they did not want to kill this old man. So they said, all you have to do is recant, or technically speaking, what he said is repent of Christ, meaning turn away from Christ and just say that you no longer believe in him. And Polycarp's famous for his saying, for 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How could I do such a thing to my master? So sadly, he brought him, went to execute him, and all he had to do as he would stand before the arena is say, away with the atheists. And all that he had to do then was point to the Christians that were with him there, and he would have been spared. Because at the time in which this was happening, Christians were called atheists. I'm going to record that in the next episode. But instead of him pointing to the Christians saying away with the atheists, he pointed to all of the Roman people and to the governors up there. And he said, away with the atheists. And so they decided to burn him at the stake. But if you see by this artist's rendering, according to legend, and this is just legend, the flames did not touch him. So a Roman soldier had to come in and pierce him through the heart with the sword. And that was the end of Polycarp when he was 86. So that takes us into the first few disciples after the apostles. We are now roughly into the 2nd to 3rd century AD. Hopefully this helps. Catch us next time as we will look at what is next and what is the Christian practices and why exactly were Christians being persecuted.